The story of the medieval Kingdom of Croatia begins in an era when Europe was still a fragmented mosaic of tribes, empires, and shifting loyalties. The 9th and 10th centuries were a time of turbulence and transformation, when the fall of great powers left a vacuum that ambitious rulers sought to fill. At the edge of the Adriatic Sea, among rugged mountains and fertile plains, a new identity was beginning to take shape. This was not yet the Croatia we know today, but rather a land of scattered Slavic tribes, bound together by tradition, faith, and a growing desire for unity. And at the center of this transformation would rise a figure whose name still echoes through history: King Tomislav, the man remembered as the first king of Croatia. But to understand how Tomislav could unite a people and forge a kingdom, we must first return to the early centuries of Slavic migration into the Balkans. By the 7th century, the lands of Dalmatia, Slavonia, and the surrounding regions were a contested frontier. The Byzantine Empire, though still powerful, struggled to maintain its influence along the Adriatic coast. At the same time, Avar horsemen and migrating tribes swept through the region, leaving instability in their wake. Into this chaos came the Croats, a group of Slavic peoples who would settle along the Adriatic coast and inland valleys, adapting to the land and eventually laying the foundations for a new society. The early Croats were not a unified kingdom but rather a collection of zupas, tribal territories ruled by local leaders known as Zupans. These clans were fiercely independent, often feuding with one another, but they shared cultural and linguistic ties that hinted at a deeper unity waiting to be realized. Over time, contact with Byzantium and Rome exposed them to the broader Christian world. Missionaries arrived, bringing not only religion but also systems of governance, literacy, and the concept of a Christian monarch who ruled with divine sanction. Slowly, the Croats were drawn into the orbit of European Christendom. By the 9th century, this transformation was accelerating. The Croats had begun to organize themselves into two main duchies: Pannonian Croatia in the north and Dalmatian Croatia along the coast. These duchies were not yet kingdoms, but they represented the first steps toward centralized rule. Dukes such as Trpimir I, who reigned in the mid-9th century, laid the groundwork by strengthening ties with the papacy and asserting authority over neighboring tribes. Trpimir is often credited with establishing the Trpimirovic dynasty, from which King Tomislav himself would later descend. Religion played a central role in this evolution. Christianity gave the Croats not only a shared faith but also international recognition. The papacy in Rome saw the Croats as valuable allies against both pagan tribes and rival powers in the region. By the late 9th century, Croatia had become firmly Christianized, with churches rising in coastal towns and monastic life spreading inland. This spiritual unity would become a cornerstone of the emerging kingdom, binding together people who had once lived in fragmented tribal communities. But faith alone was not enough. The 9th and 10th centuries were marked by constant threats from outside forces, and survival required strength. The Magyars, a nomadic people from the steppes, swept into the Carpathian Basin in the late 9th century and soon began raiding southward. The Byzantine Empire, though weakened, still claimed suzerainty over Dalmatian towns and often sought to impose its influence. To the east, the rising First Bulgarian Empire loomed as a powerful adversary. In this dangerous landscape, the Croats needed not only unity but also a leader capable of defending their lands and asserting independence. That leader would be Tomislav. Born into the Trpimirovic dynasty in the late 9th century, Tomislav inherited a realm that was growing in strength but still vulnerable to outside pressures. Sources about his life are scarce, and much of his story comes to us through chronicles written centuries later. Yet what is clear is that by the early 10th century, Tomislav had risen as the preeminent Duke of Croatia. His reign coincided with a period of upheaval across Europe: the disintegration of Carolingian authority in the west, the expansion of Magyar power, and the shifting alliances of Byzantium and Bulgaria. Against this backdrop, Tomislav would seize the opportunity to transform Croatia from a duchy into a recognized kingdom. The turning point came in 925, when Pope John X formally acknowledged Tomislav as King of Croatia. This coronation was not just a ceremonial title. It was a declaration that Croatia was now part of the European order of Christian monarchies. For the Croats, it was a moment of immense pride. A people once seen as tribal outsiders were now recognized as a kingdom in their own right. For Rome, it was a strategic alliance, securing a Christian ally in a volatile region where both Byzantine and Bulgar influence loomed large. Tomislav's kingship was more than a matter of papal approval. It was backed by real military power. Under his rule, Croatia is said to have commanded an army of 100,000 infantry, 60,000 cavalry, and a navy of 80 warships. These numbers, recorded in Byzantine sources, may be exaggerated, but they reflect the image of a kingdom capable of projecting formidable strength. Whether or not the figures were accurate, Tomislav's Croatia was undeniably a rising power in the Balkans, feared by enemies and respected by allies. The formation of this kingdom was not a peaceful process. Tomislav had to assert control over rival Zupans, consolidate his authority, and defend his realm from encroaching forces. His reign coincided with conflicts against the Magyars, whose raids threatened Croatia's northern borders. To the south and east, Tomislav faced pressure from Bulgaria under the ambitious Tsar Simeon I, whose empire sought to dominate the Balkans. Yet in this crucible of conflict, Tomislav proved himself not only as a warrior, but also as a statesman, skillfully balancing alliances and demonstrating the resilience of his people. As Croatia entered the 10th century under Tomislav's leadership, it stood at a crossroads. No longer a collection of tribes, it was now a kingdom recognized by the papacy and feared by rivals. His people, once fragmented, were bound together by faith, culture, and the authority of a king. The Adriatic coast, dotted with fortified towns and thriving ports, became a lifeline for trade and diplomacy, connecting Croatia to the broader Mediterranean world. Inland, villages and fortresses testified to the kingdom's ability to defend itself against the incursions of powerful enemies. But with recognition came new challenges. The kingdom's survival depended on maintaining unity in the face of external threats and internal rivalries. The Croats had risen from obscurity to become a kingdom, but whether they could hold this fragile unity together would be the true test of Tomislav's reign. The birth of the medieval Kingdom of Croatia was, therefore, not merely the story of one man's coronation. It was the culmination of centuries of struggle, adaptation, and ambition, from scattered tribes to Christian duchies, and finally to a recognized kingdom. Croatia's emergence in the 10th century marked a turning point in the history of the Balkans. And at its center stood Tomislav, remembered as the first king, a ruler who forged a nation out of division and laid the foundation for centuries of Croatian identity. But how would this new kingdom defend itself against the storm of enemies that surrounded it? Could Tomislav's Croatia withstand the relentless pressure of the Bulgarians, the raids of the Magyars, and the ambitions of Byzantium? The answers to these questions would determine whether Croatia's newfound status was a fleeting moment of glory or the dawn of a lasting kingdom. When Tomislav rose to the throne as Croatia's first king in 925, he inherited not only a crown but also a precarious balance of power. His kingdom lay at the crossroads of empires and ambitions. The Magyars pressed from the north, raiding fertile lands and threatening to establish dominance over the Pannonian Plain. The Byzantines eyed the Adriatic coast with suspicion, unwilling to relinquish their ancient claims. And to the east, the formidable Tsar Simeon I of Bulgaria sought to expand his empire across the Balkans. Tomislav's Croatia, though newly recognized, was immediately forced into a struggle for survival. What set Tomislav apart was his understanding that kingship was more than a title. It was an active role that required both the sword and the cross, military strength to defend the realm, and religious legitimacy to secure its place among the powers of Europe. He knew that without both, Croatia's kingdom would collapse into dust as quickly as it had risen. The Magyars were the first and most persistent threat. These horsemen of the steppe had swept into the Carpathian Basin in the late 9th century, establishing a foothold in what would later become Hungary. Swift and ruthless, they launched raids into neighboring territories, striking fear into settled populations who had little defense against their mobility. For Croatia, these incursions endangered the northern duchies, where fertile fields and trade routes lay exposed. Tomislav responded with reforms that transformed Croatia's military. Byzantine chroniclers described his forces in awe: 100,000 infantry, 60,000 cavalry, and 80 warships. Historians debate the accuracy of these numbers, yet even if exaggerated, they suggest a kingdom capable of rapid mobilization and impressive organization. The Croats had adapted their warfare to match their enemies, blending cavalry for open plains, infantry for rugged terrain, and naval power for the Adriatic coast. Tomislav's army was not just large, it was versatile. The Adriatic Sea was Croatia's lifeline. Control of the coast meant not only defense against maritime raids but also access to trade with Italy and beyond. The navy, consisting of sleek warships known as Sagina, patrolled the waters and deterred pirates who threatened commercial routes. This maritime strength also projected power outward, showing neighbors that Croatia was no longer a landlocked duchy, but a seafaring kingdom with influence stretching across the Adriatic. Military strength alone would not guarantee Croatia's survival. Tomislav knew that alliances were forged not only through blood but also through faith. The kingdom's embrace of Christianity bound it to the wider network of European powers. By receiving his crown with papal blessing, Tomislav positioned Croatia as a defender of the Latin Church, a crucial move in a region where religious loyalties were contested between Rome and Constantinople. The papacy saw in Tomislav an ally against both the encroaching Orthodox influence of Byzantium and the pagan raids that destabilized Christendom's frontiers. In return, Tomislav gained legitimacy and a powerful symbolic mantle. He was not just a tribal warlord but a Christian king, ruling with divine sanction. Churches flourished under his reign, not merely as places of worship, but as centers of authority that reinforced his rule across fragmented territories. This union of sword and cross gave Tomislav's kingdom cohesion. Tribal leaders who once resisted central authority now recognized that loyalty to the king was also loyalty to the church. It was a subtle but profound shift. Croatia was no longer a collection of zupas, but a Christian monarchy aligned with the currents of European politics. Yet no papal blessing could shield Croatia from the ambitions of Simeon I of Bulgaria. Known as Simeon the Great, this czar had transformed Bulgaria into the dominant power of the Balkans. By the early 10th century, his armies threatened both Byzantium and neighboring states, and his ambition was nothing less than the imperial crown of Constantinople itself. Croatia, strategically located between Byzantine Dalmatia and the Western Balkans, found itself directly in Simeon's path. Conflict was inevitable. Around 926, Simeon's forces clashed with Tomislav's army in what would become one of the defining tests of Croatian strength, the Battle of the Bosnian Highlands. While precise details are scarce, sources suggest that Tomislav decisively defeated the Bulgarians in the mountainous terrain. His forces, well adapted to rugged landscapes, used their mobility and local knowledge to outmaneuver Simeon's larger army. The victory was not merely military, it was symbolic. It demonstrated that Croatia could stand against one of the most feared powers in the region. For Simeon, the defeat was a rare humiliation. For Tomislav, it was a triumph that cemented his reputation as a protector of Christendom. The papacy celebrated the victory, hailing Tomislav as a bulwark against Bulgarian expansion. For the Croats, it was a moment of pride, a validation that their kingdom was no longer a fragile creation but a resilient state capable of defending its sovereignty. Despite this success, Tomislav was not reckless. He understood that Croatia could not rely solely on warfare. Diplomacy was equally essential. Following his victory over Simeon, Tomislav cultivated closer ties with Byzantium, ensuring that the empire recognized his authority in Dalmatia. Byzantine sources acknowledged him as ruler of the Croats, granting Croatia an important foothold in imperial diplomacy. This recognition gave Tomislav leverage in negotiations, securing trade rights and strengthening his legitimacy. Tomislav also maintained communication with Rome, balancing between East and West in a region where loyalties were fragile. By playing larger powers against one another, he ensured that Croatia remained independent rather than falling under the dominance of either empire. This delicate balancing act would become a hallmark of Croatian survival for centuries, as later rulers navigated between Venice, Hungary, and the Ottomans. Legends grew around Tomislav during his reign. He was remembered not only as a ruler but as a warrior who rode at the head of his armies, clad in armor, inspiring his soldiers with both courage and faith. Chroniclers painted him as a king who embodied the virtues of his people: resilience, adaptability, and loyalty. His victories over the Magyars and Bulgarians gave the Croats a sense of collective identity, binding them together under the banner of the kingdom. But with every triumph came new challenges. The Magyars remained a constant threat, raiding whenever opportunities arose. The Byzantines, though acknowledging Tomislav, never truly abandoned their ambitions along the Adriatic. And Simeon's death in 927 did not end Bulgarian influence in the Balkans. The fragile balance that Tomislav maintained required constant vigilance. As the 10th century progressed, Tomislav's kingdom stood as a rare success story in a region often torn apart by conquest. His ability to unify tribes, command armies, and secure papal recognition transformed Croatia from a duchy into a kingdom with a clear place in European history. Yet historians caution that his reign was not without its fragility. Much depended on his personal leadership, and questions lingered about whether his successors could maintain the delicate equilibrium he had built. Still, Tomislav's reign planted the seeds of a legacy. The idea of a united Croatian kingdom had taken root. The military reforms he enacted, the alliances he forged, and the recognition he won from both Rome and Byzantium established a foundation that would influence the region for centuries. For the Croats, Tomislav became more than a king. He became the symbol of their identity, the embodiment of their struggle for survival and recognition. By the time Tomislav's reign entered its later years, Croatia had grown into a formidable kingdom, yet it remained surrounded by powerful adversaries. Every decision, whether military or diplomatic, was a gamble between survival and destruction. The question loomed: could Croatia maintain its strength after Tomislav, or was the kingdom's glory tied only to the charisma and skill of its first king? As Europe entered the uncertain tides of the 10th century, the story of Croatia was far from complete. Tomislav had proven that unity was possible, that a fragmented land could rise into a kingdom. But history is merciless, and the fate of nations often hinges not only on their victories but also on their ability to endure after the victories fade. The medieval Kingdom of Croatia stood at its zenith under Tomislav's rule. The sword had defended its borders, and the cross had sanctified its crown. Yet the true test was still to come. Could the kingdom survive beyond its founder? Or would Tomislav's Croatia vanish into legend, remembered only as a fleeting moment of glory in the shifting sands of the Balkans? The reign of King Tomislav had elevated Croatia to heights never seen before. His victories over the Magyars and Bulgarians, his naval strength in the Adriatic, and his recognition by both Rome and Byzantium placed the Croatian kingdom firmly on the medieval map. But history is merciless in reminding us that the strength of a kingdom often hinges not only on one great ruler, but on what follows after him. When Tomislav died around 928, the kingdom he had built stood at a crossroads. The unity he forged among the tribes was fragile, and without his commanding presence, cracks began to appear. It was now the task of his successors to maintain the delicate balance between the cross of the church, which legitimized their rule, and the crown, which bound the people together under one king. The exact circumstances of Tomislav's death remain obscure. Medieval chronicles are frustratingly silent, leaving historians to speculate whether he died in battle, illness, or natural causes. What is certain is that his passing left a vacuum of authority. Croatia, though recognized as a kingdom, was still relatively young as a political entity. Without Tomislav's charisma and military prowess, the nobility, those same tribal leaders who had once submitted to his rule, grew restless. His immediate successor is believed to have been King Trpimir II, from the same royal dynasty. Trpimir's reign was not marked by sweeping victories or dramatic reforms, but by the slow, cautious effort to maintain what Tomislav had secured. He leaned heavily on the church, ensuring that papal support remained strong. Letters from Pope John X suggest that Croatia was still seen as a vital Christian bulwark in the Balkans, though less dominant without Tomislav at its helm. Yet already, the nobility began to test the limits of royal authority. Tomislav's centralized power had been an anomaly. The Croatian political structure was traditionally decentralized, with zupans, local lords, exercising control over their own districts. Without a strong king to bind them, their ambitions grew, threatening the cohesion of the realm. Even as Croatia looked inward, external pressures continued. The Adriatic Sea, the kingdom's lifeline, was contested not only by pirates and local rivals, but by the ever-ambitious Venetian Republic. Venice, rising in maritime power, sought to control trade routes along the Dalmatian coast. For centuries, Dalmatian cities like Split, Zadar, and Dubrovnik had been cultural outposts of Byzantium. Now, they were caught between Croatian kings on one side and Venetian fleets on the other. Trpimir II and his successors tried to assert dominance over these coastal cities, sometimes through force, sometimes through diplomacy. But Venice, backed by its expanding naval capabilities, was an adversary not easily subdued. Tensions flared throughout the 10th century as both sides vied for supremacy in the Adriatic. For the Croats, the loss of influence over Dalmatian cities meant not only a blow to prestige but also a weakening of trade revenues that fueled their economy. If Venice posed one challenge, Byzantium posed another. The empire still claimed Dalmatia as part of its sphere of influence, despite recognizing Tomislav decades earlier. Byzantine emperors, especially during the reign of Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus, continued to view the Adriatic coast as imperial territory, even if their ability to enforce that claim had waned. Croatian rulers, caught between Byzantine prestige and Venetian ambition, were forced into a balancing act. At times they aligned with Byzantium to check Venetian power. At other times they courted Venice to push back against Byzantine influence. This constant diplomatic chess game became the hallmark of Croatian survival, though it drained the kingdom's resources and divided its nobility over which path to follow. In the midst of these struggles, the role of the Catholic Church in Croatia only deepened. The papacy, recognizing the vulnerability of its ally, worked to strengthen ecclesiastical structures in the region. New bishoprics were established, and royal patronage of monasteries increased. Kings sought legitimacy not only through papal recognition but by positioning themselves as defenders of Christianity against both pagan raiders and Orthodox rivals. But this alignment with Rome came at a cost. The Byzantine Church, promoting orthodoxy, maintained influence in the Balkans. The Croats, caught in the middle, experienced internal tensions between Latin and Slavic liturgical practices. While Rome pushed for Latinization, many local priests and communities clung to the Slavic rite introduced by Saints Cyril and Methodius. This dispute threatened to fracture religious unity, and with it, political unity. By the mid-10th century, the struggle over liturgy became a political weapon. Kings who favored Rome could count on papal backing but risked alienating parts of their population. Those who tolerated the Slavic rite risked papal censure. Thus, religion became intertwined with politics, another layer of complexity in Croatia's fragile kingdom. After Trpimir II, the throne passed to King Kresimir I, and later his son Mihail Kresimir II. Their reigns continued the cautious strategy of survival, maintaining papal ties, negotiating with Venice, and defending against Magyar raids. But the pressures only mounted. The Magyars, now settling firmly into the Carpathian Basin, transformed from raiders into a structured kingdom. This meant that Croatia faced not merely incursions but a rising state on its northern frontier. At times, alliances were struck. At other times, were loomed. The constant shifting of allegiances drained Croatia's strength, as each king was forced to adapt to the changing landscape of power. Meanwhile, internal noble families grew bolder. With each succession, disputes erupted over legitimacy. The crown, once unifying under Tomislav, became a contested prize. The Zupans leveraged foreign alliances, sometimes siding with Venice, sometimes with Hungary, occasionally even appealing to Byzantium, to strengthen their own positions. In this fractious environment, the authority of the king was tested again and again. Despite these challenges, the Croatian kingdom of the 10th century was not one of decline. Rather, it experienced a fragile prosperity. Agriculture thrived in fertile valleys, trade linked coastal towns to Italy and the broader Mediterranean, and the church fostered literacy and cultural growth. Monasteries became centers of learning, preserving not only religious texts but also historical records that would later inform our understanding of the kingdom. But prosperity was always tempered by insecurity. Every harvest risked being raided by Magyars. Every shipment of goods risked being seized by Venetians. Every succession risked plunging the realm into noble conflict. The Croats lived in a constant state of vigilance, their identity forged in the crucible of survival. If Tomislav had been the warrior king, his successors were the caretakers of survival. They lacked his glory, but their reigns were no less important. They preserved the very idea of Croatian kingship, ensuring that the kingdom did not collapse after its founder. Even as power fluctuated, the crown endured, and with it the notion that Croatia was not a mere duchy or province but a kingdom recognized among Europe's states. This continuity mattered. It allowed later rulers, especially those of the 11th century, to claim a direct lineage back to Tomislav and to wield that legacy as political capital. For the Croats, remembering Tomislav's victories became a way to endure their own struggles. It was not only a memory of glory but a reminder of what they could still be. By the close of the 10th century, Croatia remained independent, but its position was precarious. The power of the king was contested by nobles, the Adriatic was dominated increasingly by Venice, and new threats loomed from both north and east. Yet the kingdom survived, a testament to its resilience. The sword had defended its lands, the cross had legitimized its rulers, but survival now depended on something more elusive: the ability to navigate shifting alliances and internal fractures without losing the essence of kingship. As the 11th century dawned, Croatia stood at a threshold. Would it rise again to the heights of Tomislav's era, or would it sink into fragmentation and foreign domination? The answer would lie not in the past glories of kings, but in the decisions of those who inherited their fragile crown. The image of King Tomislav's Croatia, often remembered as a kingdom united under one banner, can easily mislead us into imagining an unshakable, eternal state. But history is never that simple. As the 10th century unfolded, the Croatian kingdom faced challenges on every frontier. Political rivals in the north, religious struggles that threatened unity, and constant pressure from larger empires hungry for dominance in the Balkans. And yet, this fragile kingdom managed not just to survive, but to leave behind a legacy that would resonate centuries later. But how? How did this medieval Croatian kingdom, perched between powerful neighbors, manage to endure for so long? And more importantly, why do historians today look back at this period as the golden century of Croatian independence? To understand, we must journey deeper into the kingdom's struggles and the moments where its fate hung in the balance. By the mid-10th century, Croatia stood at the crossroads of major powers. To the east, the Byzantine Empire still dreamed of regaining influence over the Adriatic coast, claiming suzerainty over Dalmatian cities. To the north, the rising power of the Hungarian tribes looked southward, eyeing Croatia's fertile lands. To the west, Venice, ever ambitious, plotted to expand its naval supremacy and weaken Croatia's control of maritime trade routes. Imagine being a ruler of Croatia in this era. Every decision could spark conflict with one of these powers. A misstep with Byzantium could see the loss of Dalmatian ports. A clash with Venice could mean losing access to the Adriatic. A stumble with the Hungarians could bring war into Croatia's very heartland. Survival demanded a delicate balance, an art that Croatian kings had to master. But political threats were not the only challenge. Internally, Croatia was torn between two religious influences: Rome and Constantinople. Christianity had already taken firm root, but whether Croatia would fall under the authority of the Pope or the Patriarch of Constantinople remained a question of destiny. This religious tug-of-war was not a mere theological debate. It carried real political weight. Aligning with Rome meant closer ties to the West, to the Holy Roman Empire, and to the papacy's moral authority. Aligning with Constantinople meant recognition from the Byzantine Empire and perhaps protection against encroaching powers. It was during the reign of King Tomislav and his successors that Croatia leaned firmly toward Rome. This was no small choice. It set Croatia apart from many of its Balkan neighbors, who increasingly gravitated toward Orthodox Christianity. The result was a unique cultural and religious identity, a Slavic kingdom that remained deeply connected to Western Christendom, while still sitting geographically close to Byzantium's sphere. And here lies a fascinating paradox. By choosing Rome, Croatia forged bonds that would later aid its survival. Yet this choice also ensured centuries of tension with Orthodox powers to the east. But in the 10th century, it gave Croatia a sense of unity, an identity anchored in the Latin West. Perhaps one of the most underestimated aspects of medieval Croatia's strength was its naval power. Often when we imagine medieval kingdoms, we picture knights, castles, and cavalry charges. But Croatia, with its long Adriatic coast, understood that mastery of the sea was just as vital. The Croatian navy patrolled the Adriatic, deterring pirates and protecting merchant fleets. It also posed a direct challenge to Venice. In fact, several medieval chronicles mention naval skirmishes between Croats and Venetians, battles not just for military dominance, but for control of the lucrative Adriatic trade routes. Here's where we see the genius of Croatia's geopolitical strategy. While its army defended the inland borders, its navy ensured that Croatia could not be cut off from the wider world. This maritime strength gave it leverage in negotiations with both Venice and Byzantium. It also allowed Croatia to maintain its independence longer than many of its landlocked neighbors. A kingdom is not defined only by battles. During the 10th century, Croatia developed its own distinct cultural and legal traditions. Kings patronized churches and monasteries, building stone structures that still stand today, like the Church of St. Donatus in Zadar. These were not just religious symbols. They were declarations of power, permanence, and civilization. Croatia also began codifying laws that blended old tribal customs with Christian principles. This legal framework helped unify the kingdom's diverse population, transforming a patchwork of tribes into subjects of a crown. It was, in many ways, the birth of a national identity. One could imagine a medieval village in the Croatian hinterland. Stone houses clustered near a wooden church, villagers gathering to hear news from the king's envoys, and priests reading Latin prayers while still speaking in the familiar Slavic tongue. This fusion of local traditions and Western Christianity created a society both unique and resilient. But golden ages never last forever. By the second half of the 10th century, cracks began to show. Rival noble families, jealous of royal authority, plotted rebellions. Some Croatian dukes, especially in the coastal regions, flirted with alliances to Venice or Byzantium, seeking to carve out local autonomy. Even worse, the Hungarian threat grew steadily. In 925, King Tomislav had defeated Hungarian forces decisively, but by the late 10th century, Hungary was consolidating into a kingdom of its own. With stronger armies and ambitions that stretched southward, Hungary loomed as a growing danger. Croatia's survival now depended not just on military might, but on political cunning. The kings who followed Tomislav had to maneuver carefully, negotiating treaties, arranging marriages, and maintaining a fragile balance of alliances. Some succeeded, others did not. By the early 11th century, the delicate balance could no longer hold. In 1102, following a series of succession crises and noble rivalries, Croatia entered into a personal union with Hungary under King Koloman. Historians debate whether this was a conquest or a negotiated agreement, but the result was clear. Croatia was no longer an independent kingdom. Yet here lies a profound twist. Though Croatia became united with Hungary, it retained a remarkable degree of autonomy. The Croatian nobility insisted on preserving their laws, their privileges, and their institutions. The Pacta Conventa, a legendary agreement between Croatia's nobles and the Hungarian king, symbolized this arrangement. Whether myth or reality, it reflected a deeper truth. Croatia had lost independence but not identity. So what was the legacy of the medieval Croatian kingdom of the 10th century? On one level, it was the story of a kingdom that rose under King Tomislav, flourished for nearly 2 centuries, and eventually became bound to Hungary. But on a deeper level, it was the story of a people who forged a lasting identity. The Croatian crown may have passed into foreign hands, but the memory of Tomislav's kingdom lived on. For centuries afterward, Croatians would look back to this golden age as proof that they were not merely a province of larger empires but heirs to their own royal tradition. In this way, the medieval Croatian kingdom became more than a historical episode. It became a symbol, a reminder that even small nations, surrounded by larger powers, can write their own story of resilience, faith, and defiance. Picture this: the ruins of medieval Croatian fortresses scattered across hillsides, silent stone churches standing as witnesses of another era, the Adriatic waves crashing against coastal cities that once flew the royal standard of King Tomislav. These are not just relics. They are echoes of a kingdom that dared to stand tall in the turbulent world of the 10th century. And so, while Croatia eventually entered into union with Hungary, its medieval kingdom remains a powerful chapter in its history. A chapter that shows us how fragile independence can be, but also how the spirit of a people can endure through centuries of struggle. With this, the story of the medieval Croatian kingdom closes, not as a tragedy, but as a reminder of resilience. Its rise and fall mirror the struggles of many nations caught between empires. And yet, in its brief golden age, Croatia carved out a legacy that remains alive to this day. History often buries small kingdoms beneath the shadows of larger empires. Rome, Byzantium, the Ottoman Empire, these are the names that dominate our memory of Europe's past. Yet, sometimes, in the folds of time, there appear smaller stories that defy oblivion. The medieval kingdom of Croatia, though independent for just a few centuries, is one of those stories. And if we listen carefully, its echoes still shape the identity of an entire nation. But why does this matter today? Why should the struggles of a 10th century kingdom still capture our imagination? To answer that, we must peel back the layers, not only of battles and treaties but of memory, identity, and the idea of what it means for a nation to endure. When King Tomislav was crowned in 925, Croatia entered the stage of European politics as an independent kingdom. He unified tribes, created an army formidable enough to defeat the Hungarians, and forged alliances with both Rome and Byzantium. For a brief moment, Croatia stood tall, recognized by its neighbors as a sovereign power. But as we saw in the previous chapter, no throne in the medieval Balkans was secure. After Tomislav's death, Croatia faced succession struggles, noble rivalries, and the pressure of powerful neighbors. By 1102, Croatia entered into union with Hungary, a turning point that ended its independent monarchy. Yet here lies the paradox. Though the throne was fragile, the idea of a Croatian kingdom was indestructible. Even after union, Croats continued to identify themselves as heirs of Tomislav's crown. Their laws, their privileges, and their institutions, protected fiercely by the nobility, became living reminders that Croatia was not merely conquered but a kingdom with its own past. This is where Croatia's medieval legacy shines brightest. Independence was lost, but memory survived. And memory, as history teaches us, can be stronger than steel. Walk through modern Croatia today, and you will still encounter the symbols of that kingdom. Statues of King Tomislav rise proudly in squares. Medieval churches, the Adriatic coast, their stone walls whispering prayers in both Latin and the Slavic tongue. The red and white checkered coat of arms, the Sahavnica, has its roots in medieval heraldry. These symbols are not just relics. They are anchors. They remind Croatians that their identity was forged not by foreign empires, but by their own kings and people. In fact, even under Hungarian, Venetian, or Habsburg rule, Croatians clung to these symbols as proof of their distinctiveness. Here is the lesson. Medieval Croatia mattered not just for what it achieved militarily, but for the cultural identity it gave its people. A sense that they were not just a province, but a nation with a crown, a church, and a legacy of sovereignty. Some might argue, if Croatia lost independence in 1102, doesn't that make its medieval kingdom a failed experiment? But the truth is more complex. Consider this: many small medieval kingdoms disappeared entirely, their names remembered only in footnotes. Yet Croatia endured. Even as Hungary extended influence, Croatia kept its separate institutions. Even as Venice seized coastal cities, Croats continued to fight for their land. Even as the Ottoman Empire swept through the Balkans in the 15th century, Croats invoked the memory of King Tomislav's army, reminding themselves that they had once stood as defenders of their homeland. The medieval kingdom did not vanish. It transformed into a foundation upon which later generations built. It gave Croats a story of origin, a heroic chapter to point back to in times of crisis. And that story, passed from century to century, helped sustain them through wars, occupations, and foreign domination. We cannot forget the geopolitical reality that surrounded Croatia. In the centuries after its union with Hungary, the region became a chessboard of empires. Hungary, Venice, Byzantium, and later the Ottomans and Habsburgs. Croatia, always positioned at the frontier, bore the brunt of these struggles. In many ways, its medieval kingdom foreshadowed this role. Already in the 10th century, Croatia had been a frontier state, a buffer between East and West, between the Pope and the Patriarch, between the Adriatic and the steppes. This role did not disappear after 1102. It deepened. When the Ottomans advanced in the 15th and 16th centuries, Croatia was described as the antemural Christianitatis, the bulwark of Christendom. And the memory of the medieval kingdom, of Tomislav's army defeating Hungarians and Byzantines, became a rallying cry. Even in decline, the medieval legacy gave Croats strength to endure. Every nation has its myth of a golden age, a time when it stood united, proud, and free. For Croatians, that golden age is the medieval kingdom of the 10th century. Historians debate how golden it truly was. Some argue it was fragile, plagued by internal rivalries, and destined to collapse under the weight of external pressures. Others insist it was a period of genuine prosperity, cultural flourishing, and military strength. But myths do not depend solely on facts. They depend on memory. And in memory, the reign of King Tomislav and the century that followed shine brightly. This golden age became a touchstone for national pride, invoked during later centuries of struggle. Think of it this way: the medieval kingdom was like a spark. It burned brightly for a moment, but its light was carried forward, illuminating the centuries that followed. So what does the story of medieval Croatia teach us today? First, it reminds us that small nations can matter just as much as large empires. Croatia may not have commanded vast territories, but its story still resonates because it speaks to the human struggle for identity and independence. Second, it shows us the power of memory. Even when independence was lost, Croatians kept alive the idea of their kingdom. And in time, that memory helped them regain sovereignty in the modern era. Finally, it offers a warning. Independence is fragile. It must be protected not just with armies, but with unity, diplomacy, and culture. King Tomislav's success lay not only in his victories, but in his ability to weave together tribes, religion, and geography into a kingdom that felt real to its people. Picture the scene one last time. A medieval fortress stands in silence, its stones weathered by centuries. The Adriatic waves crash below, just as they did when Croatian kings ruled from their coastal strongholds. High on the hills, ruins of castles look down on villages that have changed little since the 10th century. In the mind's eye, we see King Tomislav's army marching, shields gleaming in the sun, banners of the red and white Czechs fluttering in the wind. We hear the clash of steel against Hungarian raiders, the chanting of priests uniting tribes under the Latin cross, the cries of merchants sailing along the Adriatic, proud that they belong to a kingdom that controls the sea. And then silence. The kingdom fades, absorbed into Hungary. But the echo remains, whispering through the ages. We were a kingdom. We had a crown. We endured. The medieval kingdom of Croatia may have lasted only a few centuries, but it carved its place in history. It stood as a rare example of a small Slavic kingdom that achieved recognition, unity, and independence during one of Europe's most turbulent centuries. Its rulers may be long gone, but their legacy lives on in symbols, in memory, and in the spirit of a nation that has never forgotten where it came from. And perhaps this is the real story, not the rise and fall of a kingdom, but the endurance of identity. Because long after crowns are lost and empires fade, memory remains. And in that memory, the medieval kingdom of Croatia still lives.